Okay, continuing on with the legislative process. Whenever a bill is passed both houses, it would go to the president if and only if it's agreed to in exactly the same form. That's word for word. All right. Well, this rarely happens. So one house passes a bill, they send it to the other house changes it, and so on and so forth. And there's a couple of technical things that could happen, but in reality, what's probably going to happen is going to go to a conference committee. So, a piece of legislation passed by the House and then passed by the Senate, they're almost always going to have two different versions of it, and it's going to be sent to a conference committee. The job of the conference committee is to reconcile the House and Senate versions of a bill and to try to arrive at a compromise version that would be agreeable to both houses. Another thing that could happen is you might have a House bill and a Senate bill that are two separate bills, but basically both deal with the same thing, and then both bills could, after passage of one House only, be sent to the conference committee, and the conference committee would reconcile both bills together. Once the conference committee gets done with its work, the next step is the conference committee report has to be approved. So you have a House bill, Senate bill, they get reconciled into one bill, or the House passed the bill, then the Senate passed the bill with some amendments, goes to the conference committee reconciles both bills, then it has to be approved by both of the houses again. So the conference committee report must then be approved by the House and then the Senate. And they can't change the conference committee report. They either accept it or reject it. There can be no other amendments. It's either yes or no, an up or down vote. Once or if both houses approve the conference committee report, then finally it'll go to the president, and the president has several options to choose from. The first option is he can approve the piece of legislation, and if he approves it, he will sign it, and once he signs it, it becomes law. Okay. Then of course he could veto it. If the bill is vetoed, then Congress, by 2/3 of both houses, can override the presidential veto. More realistically, they can attempt to override the presidential veto. In reality, they probably won't be able to do it. The veto is around 96% effective. It's very rare that Congress is able to override it. So veto is a pretty potent tool. Sometimes presidents use that to force Congress to negotiate. The next question is going to be, well, what's going to happen if the president does nothing? Well, there's two possibilities if the president does nothing. Okay. The first one is if the president does nothing and Congress is in session, then it is approved. Okay. In fact, that's the most likely course of action. Let me say that again. If the president does nothing and Congress is in session, the bill will become a law without the president's signature. And that is probably what will happen to most pieces of legislation that go to the president. The next thing that could happen is the president could do nothing and Congress would not be in session. This would occur toward the end of a session. Congress passes the bill, sends it to the president, and before he acts on it, Congress goes ahead and adjourns sine die. And then if the president does nothing, what happens is the bill is not a law. And this would be called a pocket veto. And basically that doesn't happen anymore. The reason why it doesn't happen is whenever Congress gets done with the session and they send all the bills that they had left to the president, they will remain in what are called pro forma sessions, simply meeting for the purpose of meeting to prevent the president from using the pocket veto. So the president can approve a piece of legislation by signing it. He can veto a piece of legislation, and Congress can attempt to override by 2/3 of both houses. That's almost impossible to get. If the president does nothing and Congress is in session, the bill is a law. If the president does nothing and Congress is not in session, then the bill is not a law. And that's probably the easiest way to remember it. Do nothing, Congress is in session, is a law. Do nothing, Congress not in session, not a law. That's the pocket veto, and it's pretty rare. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the powers of Congress. And we're going to break down or categorize these powers into several different categories. We're going to look at the legislative powers of Congress, that is to say, the powers of Congress that revolve around deciding what statutory law is going to be. And then we're going to look at the executive powers of Congress. What powers does Congress have that relate to how law is executed, carried out, or enforced? Then we're going to look at diplomatic powers of Congress, military powers of Congress, and then finally, judicial powers of Congress. Powers of Congress that relate to how the law is carried out, how the law is interpreted and applied to individual circumstances. First thing, legislative powers of Congress. Congress obviously has the power to make statutory law. The Constitution of the United States vests this power in Congress. Another legislative power of Congress is to override the veto. Okay, so that's an action that Congress can take, and it does deal with what is the law going to be. Therefore, it's considered to be a legislative power. And as previously mentioned, it requires 2/3 vote of both houses and is very hard to get. Another legislative power of Congress would be to tax, spend, and borrow. Those are legislative functions of Congress. And then treaty. And the reason why I have treaty as a legislative power is because treaties have the effect of law in the United States. Now, treaty will also appear under diplomatic, but I put it here as well because treaties do have the effect of law inside the United States. Executive powers of Congress. And again, these are powers that Congress has that relate to how the law is executed, carried out, or enforced. First thing, structure the executive branch. The executive branch of the United States, all the bureaucratic agencies and so on, the cabinet departments and so forth, those are all created by Congress. Congress decides how many agencies there'll be, what each agency will do, the staffing for each agency, and so forth. So while the president is chief executive, he does not possess the power to structure, to organize, or reorganize the executive branch. That is in the hands of Congress. Congress makes the agencies. Congress can eliminate agencies. Congress controls the executive branch's budget. And in all reality, this is perhaps the most potent tool that Congress has concerning the executive branch, because realistically, if you don't have any money, you really can't do very much. So it's not just what the executive branch is authorized to do, it's what do they have the money to do. So Congress can fund those things that it likes. It can defund those things that it doesn't like. Congress doesn't necessarily give a lump sum to an agency. They can specify in their appropriations process how much gets spent on personnel and how much gets spent on equipment, for example. So they can specify pretty down to the minutia of what happens, or they can give the president a blank check. Not likely, but that power to control the money is a significant power of Congress. This is sometimes referred to as the power of the purse. The Congress has the authority, well, specifically the Senate has the authority to approve executive branch appointments. Now, some people want to talk about, well, they approve members of the cabinet. Well, that's true, but the president appoints far more people than just the 15 heads of the different executive departments. And some of the most powerful people appointed by the president aren't members of the cabinet. So let's broaden our thinking to talk about how the president appoints thousands of executives, but many of those, beyond the scope of the cabinet, have to be approved by the Senate. So they can either approve them or reject them. The Congress has the authority to impeach and remove executives. This isn't just about impeaching and removing the president or vice president. Rather, the Constitution says all civil officers of the United States are subject to and liable for impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, realistically, in terms of real-world application, this would be limited to the president and vice president, because if a secretary had scandal surrounding them so much that the House began impeachment proceedings, that person would be fired. The actual impeachment process is where the House passes what are called articles of impeachment. If they are passed, that person is said to be impeached. Then the Senate would conduct a trial, and if convicted by 2/3, then that individual would be removed from office. Here's an example. Bill Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives. So Bill Clinton was impeached. The trial was then held in the Senate, and the charges were not approved by a 2/3 majority. Therefore, Bill Clinton was not convicted of those charges that he was impeached. Okay, moving on. The Congress has the authority to elect the president and vice president if and only if the Electoral College fails. So if the Electoral College fails to return a majority, then the House of Representatives will select from among the top 3 candidates in the Electoral College a winner. But the quirky part is each state only gets 1 vote. So if the Electoral College fails to return a winner with a majority vote, then the House of Representatives will choose from among the top 3 candidates, and each state will receive 1 vote when picking the president in the House. The Senate will then also have the authority to pick the vice president. Legislative veto. Congress can exercise, or at least has exercised, what is called the legislative veto, which is Congress's ability to invalidate administrative actions. If you'll recall, in the lecture on bureaucracy, we'll talk about the fact that administrative agencies will pass what are called administrative regulations under the authority granted to them by Congress. Congress reserves for itself the authority to invalidate those actions through a process known as a legislative veto. The legislative veto is questionable concerning its constitutionality. The court, in the case of Immigration and Naturalization Service versus Chadha, has ruled that the one-house legislative veto isn't constitutional, but as of yet, it has not ruled on the two-house variety, so we still leave it on the list of executive powers. And this isn't really a power, but it's a term, and it's called legislative oversight. And this is the role that Congress plays in overseeing the executive branch. So how does Congress oversee the executive branch? Well, they look at its budget, they look at its structure. So kind of the rest of the things on this slide, that's how Congress oversees the executive branch. The tools of oversight would be budget, structure, confirmation, and hearings. And that's how Congress oversees the executive branch to determine if the executive branch is carrying out the law in the manner that Congress wishes. Diplomatic powers of Congress. These are powers of Congress that relate to foreign policy. First off, that's would be ratifying treaties. The Senate has the authority to ratify treaties that are negotiated by the President, and that would require a 2/3 vote of the Senate. If approved, these treaties would have the effect of law inside the United States. The Senate has the authority to approve diplomats. This would be the ambassadors to various countries, also other people involved in foreign policy. They're usually referred to as ministers, envoys, and so forth, but the term diplomat is a generic term referring to ambassadors and other individuals engaged in foreign policy. The Senate also has to approve appointments to the State Department. The U.S. State Department is the division inside the executive branch that's responsible for foreign policy. It's headed up by the Secretary of State, and other than the President, the Secretary of State is perhaps the most important person dealing with U.S. foreign policy. Another thing that's kind of quirky is what are called congressional executive agreements, or sometimes called legislative executive agreements. The best example of this is the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA is not a treaty, it is a law. If NAFTA could have been approved by 2/3 of the Senate, it could have been done as a treaty, but it was not likely that NAFTA would have been approved by 2/3 of the Senate. So it was submitted by the President to Congress, and then it was passed into law by a majority vote of both houses. And what that does is increases the power of the House of Representatives in the area of foreign policy. And then, of course, there's the ability to tax and spend. So you could tax imports, and that could have foreign policy implications. You could engage in foreign aid spending, and that it could also have foreign policy implications. So this ability to tax and spend definitely can have some foreign policy implications, and that's why I've included it on this slide.